an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Evening all, welcome to this week, a week in which the grim drumbeat of war is loud in the land once more. Our warplanes are in the skies over Iraq and Syria, and on the home front we face the greatest terrorist threat ever. So naturally, it was only right for Call Me Dave to have a pop at the BBC, or the enemy within, as it's known in the Downing Street bunker. Not because we've been especially traitorous, certainly no more than normal, but because the PM thinks we're not using the correct nomenclature when referring to the real enemy, and that this is undermining the war effort. Clearly they didn't teach him the sticks and stones nursery rhyme in prep school. Anyway, Call Me Dave thinks that if we stopped calling the terrorists Islamic State, or ISIL, or ISIS, and refer to them by the Arabic acronym Daesh, we'd be doing our bit for the war effort. Put aside the somewhat pertinent fact that Daesh is simply Arabic for ISIS or ISIL. But it is. Apparently, it sounds like another pejorative word in Arabic, and the PM thinks if we all say Daesh, the beheaders will be so demoralised they'll throw down their weapons and crawl under the stones from whence they came. So, Daesh, 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 Daesh. There you go. Enemy scattered, evil dispatched. Peace, sweetness and light return throughout the Levant and the Maghreb. Brilliant, General Dave. If only Churchill had got the hang of this war business sooner. Speaking of pointless rebranding exercises, I'm joined on the sofa tonight by two Westminster statues of liberty. Think of them as the free vote and the free love of late-night political chat. I speak, of course, of hashtag man on the left, Alan A.J. Johnson, and hashtag sad man on a train, Michael Choo-Choo Patillo. Michael, your moment of the week.
Another saying from the Prime Minister when he described those who are going to vote against his motion as being terrorist sympathisers. It was an entirely inaccurate and unworthy remark. If it betrayed his real feelings, I think that's really quite pitiful, really. Of course, it was a shot in the foot because it then completely derailed his own speech, because he was called upon repeatedly in the House of Commons to apologise. I believe he should have apologised. And of course, then it meant that at the end of the day, the accolades went not to him, but to Hilary Benn. I think in a way he deserved to lose the vote, although I must say he won it by a handsome majority, and that is what he set out to do. So I will, at the end of this long sentence, say that he must be congratulated on achieving a result which even a week ago would have seemed miraculous.
Was he not badly advised not to apologise? He must have known this was coming. It dominated the news. Surely he could have agreed a form of words he would use that involved an apology.
People keep talking about David Cameron being advised. I knew him for 15 years as the exemplary premier advisor. He doesn't need anybody else's advice. He can issue his own advice. He gave himself bad advice, if that's what you want to know.
Very well. Alan, your moment.
It had to be the Hilary Benn speech. I know we're going to come on to talk about Syria, but to be in the chamber when that 15 minutes of eloquence and in, you know, saying that you can hear a pin drop and what, he had that chamber in the palm of his hand, which is very difficult when it's packed. And I actually saw people like John Barron, who takes a contrary view, of course, to Hilary Benn, stand up at the beginning and try to intervene, as did somebody else. And they, as the speech progressed, they decided not to bother again. It was that moment that kept them in their seats, that this was a speech not to be interrupted. And however you feel about the vote, no one can deny that was a masterful speech from the dispatch.
Well, we will talk more about what it means in a moment. But first, we don't feel the cold much here on This Week. Michael only needs to cross his legs and we all feel the heat. But in the interest of turning up the temperature in our drafty little studio, we're turning to this week's UN climate change talks in Paris. Now, while there's broad agreement on the need to reduce the use of fossil fuels, there's more disagreement than the average shadow cabinet meeting about how best to meet carbon reduction targets. One man who thinks we're all getting too hot under the collar about climate change is scientist, long-term weather forecast, and brother of Jeremy, Piers Corbyn, who thinks all this talk about CO2 and increasing world temperatures is a myth. Here is his take of the week.
It's getting hot in here, so It's okay. Two T's. Despite the hype in Paris, the fact is there's no such thing as man-made climate change. Yeah, the truth is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of the United Nations is a political, not a scientific body, and it even amends scientific documents before publication to conform to diplomatic niceties.
It's getting hot in here, so take off all your clothes. I am getting so hot.
The climate alarmism plastering the media and the so-called science put forward by the United Nations is fraudulent. And what Sir David Attenborough says is a disgrace to science, and we challenge him to open debate. And one thing we would ask him is, just look at this graph. The upper curve is what their UN models predict, and you can see they fail and fail and fail again to show what really is happening in the world. The world now is cooling, and our own scientific examination of solar activity shows it will cool even more rapidly in the next 20 years. When it comes to CO2 emissions, they're failing on their own terms. They're actually not cutting them, but exporting them. They closed the British steel industry to reduce CO2 in Britain, and it's regrown in India to make more CO2. This is absurd. We've lost jobs. So let's be clear, the climate change energy charges on your electricity bill are actually a poll tax on the poor, which even causes people to die in winter when they cannot foot the bill. So why is it happening? Follow the money. Huge profits have been made from carbon trading, from expensive climate change grandiose projects. Big oil benefits from price rises. Banks benefit from any trading. You do not. Ice cream, tea, coffee, French baguette. We got it all here. Now is the time to start full debate in Britain on the future of the climate change story. It's a con and must be closed down. That's all for today.
And from the Piccadilly Whip ice cream stall in Tower Hill to the politically whipped here in Westminster. Piers Corbyn, welcome to the programme. Now,
Good to be here.
Surely for you to be right, nearly all the world's leaders, from the President of America to the President of China, plus most of the world's climate scientists, are engaged in a massive conspiracy to hoodwink us. That can't be right.
Well, of course, most of the climate scientists, you say, but that isn't true. Of this so-called survey of climate scientists of 12,000 papers, only 0.3% of them actually stated that they, from their work, that man CO2 had been the cause of warming. The other papers said nothing at all, including papers
But
by
most
myself.
of the world has signed on to this. All the leaders have their own scientific advisors. Although they argue about what to do.
No, they're appointed. You see, it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They appoint people to advise themselves. The IPCC is a political organisation, not a scientific organisation.
Why could so many people be hoodwinked, and why?
Well, it's easily done, and it has been done before. There's many things in the past which have been untrue and believed, such as, Galileo had a problem bringing forward the truth. John Harrison had a problem bringing forward the truth for 30 years about how to measure latitude. For 10 years, people didn't believe that, or believed that continental drift was impossible because of the entrenched interest groups. And if you want to know what is actually going on, we can tell you. But that graph I showed shows that the theory they put forward is not working. So under the Climate Change Act, Section 6, Part 2, it states very clearly that if the science changes, i.e. information changes, then the measures have to change and should be discussed. So what's saying is we have to reopen the debate on climate change and actually not impose these charges which are closing British steel.
But you claimed in your take there that the world is now cooling.
Yes.
But that's not borne out by either the land or the satellite temperature measurements,
It is.
it?
It is.
Not
Look at the
not
graph.
up till
Look
now.
at the graph again. Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
But the past, I mean,
No,
temperatures
well, look
now.
at the graph. The graph you
temperatures
just seen
now.
shows that.
Temperatures now are, on average, about 0.5 degrees above where they were 35 years
yeah.
ago. But people argue about a pause,
There's
but certainly
0.5
we've had,
degrees of fraud, and you can find that on the website.
But that's all the satellite measurements I know show that the temperature has
The
been right. Now
satellite
there's an
measurements-
argument about
not the satellite measurements. So-called land measurements show an increase, but they are fraudulently chosen because they change the data sets on the way through. And you can go on the weatheraction.com website and see this, or many other.
But we've
scientific
had
papers.
since, I mean, people argue about a pause, whether that's there, how long it will last. But since,
pause, okay.
since 1997, 98, we've had some of the warmest years on
Oh,
record.
we had some very warm years, yes.
So how
But
can it be called-
the
how can it be
average,
called
average
cooling?
in the last the peak, the recent peak is the same as, taking away the data fraud, the same as the peak in the in the 1940s.
Michael, you're a bit of a sceptic, I think, on global warming, but would you go as far as Piers?
Well, I'm not scientifically qualified, which Piers is, but what has made me very suspicious is that I do feel there's been a sort of bandwagon around all of this. I'm so pleased to hear Piers on the BBC, because at one point the BBC said that the debate was settled and they didn't want to hear anything more from climate skeptics. But even if one did accept that there was global warming and that it was man-made, the assumption is that the way to tackle this is by massive human self-sacrifice in the developed countries. And I think Piers makes a very good point that what that does actually is to export jobs and to export the possibility of creating carbon dioxide to other countries. But in any case, it seems to me that the first thing you would ask yourself is, what is the cost of dealing with climate change? I mean, climate change has occurred frequently in the past, and human beings have had to adapt to it. So assuming that we might adapt to it in the future rather than trying to prevent it, and I think there's a huge loss of humility in believing that we can prevent it, you know, what would be the cost of that? What would be the consequences? And I don't think we've ever had that rational debate.
Well, that's what the Stern report was about.
I,
That did the costing.
I think people
I mean,
have,
you could argue with it, but that's what it did.
I think people have got themselves into
But it's a laughing stock around the world, the Stern report.
I think people have got themselves into a frame of mind that, you know, human beings are basically sort of evil, that that we are overindulging ourselves, that what we need to do is restrain ourselves, that globalization is the consequence of this, is the cause of this, that capitalism is somehow involved in this. I mean, I think the whole thing lends itself to hysteria.
Alan, what's your take on this?
Well, I would that it were true. I mean, if Piers was absolutely right, then there is no global warming, and there shouldn't be But Piers, I'm not like Michael. I'm not qualified scientifically. But
let's open the debate. Do you agree we should open the debate?
I looked
under the
this
Climate Change
afternoon
Act, under
at the
Climate
site.
Change
I
Act.
went to the House of Commons Library and asked them. 97% of climate scientists say that climate change is real,
Okay,
that it's
Alan,
happening,
that figure
and that
is
it's
untrue.
man,
It's
and that it's
false.
man.
It's a false
made.
figure.
Well, you have to argue with the House of Commons Library. That's
But
what
also
it's
irrelevant.
But here's the
It's
question.
irrelevant.
Here's the question.
Evidence is what
It's not
counts.
not a play upon your name, as I understand it. It's peer review that looks at these different scientific papers. Who's peer reviewed your assessment?
I've had many peer-reviewed papers, and the
On this
success-
subject?
On this
well,
subject?
on the question of no, what I quote is peer-reviewed papers. On the question of the accuracy of weather action forecasts, so we have peer-reviewed success rates,
But
there,
I'm gonna-
which are based on. Our forecasts are based
There
on
are-
solar activity.
I couldn't
I've
find
written
any peer
peer-reviewed
review.
papers
But
on
your position is
meteorology. Yes.
Your position is at the extreme end, though, of scepticism. I mean, it's really denial. It's not just there are even climate scientists who can disagree about the exact temperature consequences of CO2.
A sort of a lukewarmist position.
Right, but that's not yours. You're effectively in outright denial.
Well, we're saying that the CO2 has no effect whatsoever, and that is borne out by history. If you look at history, CO2 levels follow changes in temperature, not the other way round. And that is because the temperature of the sea controls the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Because the sea itself has got 50 times more CO2 in it than the atmosphere. So the sea surface temperature controls how much goes in and out.
Why have you not managed to convince your brother?
Well, I think the situation in the Labour Party is that Jeremy has to follow Labour policy, And the Labour policy includes support the Climate Change Act.
But he
within
dines out on his climate change
no.
credentials.
Within which the Climate Change Act, it makes very clear as the science changes, then the measures should change, which means now is the time for debate. Now, my brother is very much in favour of debate, and I totally support his leadership of the party, and I look forward to more debate on this issue.
Most climate change sceptics are on the right. Where are you?
Well, I'm on the left. But there's plenty who are on the left. There's a Tom Harris from Canada who certainly, you know, he says, look, there's no reason for being either left or right on this issue. We stand for scientific truth.
There's a reason for being right or wrong, because the danger of this kind of thing is we've been through it, I believe, with GM crops. We've been through it with measles, mumps and rubella when people stopped inoculating their kids because, you know, with due respect to you, renegade scientists said that this was bad for them. And it would be horrendous if 97% of the world's scientists are right about 2% warming. Okay. And we throw all that aside and follow your conspiracies.
Let's not get hung up in the 90% figure, which there is
Look,
some.
Andrew,
which I some
what is science? Tell me what is science.
What I want to ask you, because we've only got a minute.
Evidence is what counts. Evidence
I understand that, and there is a lot of evidence around, I would suggest, that conflicts with what you've told us tonight.
No. Look on the
but let us move on.
Okay.
How do you think your brother's doing?
Superbly. He's made a different situation in Britain, where, you know, young people are now participating more than ever in politics. The Labour Party's got the biggest membership ever, and more people joined since he became leader than the membership of the Liberal Democrats.
And you don't think he's out of touch with mainstream Labour opinion, never mind the wider electorate?
Well, there's a difference. Look, I'm not here to talk about this, but there is a difference between Parliament and the party and the public. And he is fighting for proper discussion and proper representation and proper accountability in the party.
So
and I support him.
Thumbs up to the brother.
Absolutely.
All right, Piers Corbyn, thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
I've been